Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine standing on a mist-shrouded morning in the rolling green hills of Ireland's Boyne Valley. Before you rises a great grassy mound, silent and ancient, its white quartz facade gleaming in the dawn light. This is Newgrange, and it holds a secret that defies everything we think we know about the distant past. Built over 5,000 years ago, this monument is older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, older than the mighty stones of Stonehenge. Yet it was constructed not by pharaohs with armies of slaves, but by Neolithic farmers who had never seen metal tools, who knew nothing of the wheel, who left behind no written records of their extraordinary achievement. Every winter solstice, as it has for 50 centuries, a single beam of sunlight penetrates the darkness of its inner chamber in a display of astronomical precision that rivals our modern observatories. How did these ancient people accomplish such a feat? What drove them to move massive stones across 50 miles of countryside? What mystery lies buried beneath this Irish hillside that has remained hidden for millennia? But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. The morning mist clings to the emerald slopes of the Boyne Valley like the breath of sleeping giants. You stand here in the quiet of County Meath, Ireland, where the river curves through ancient pasture land and the air carries the scent of damp earth and wild grass. Before you rises something that should not exist, something that challenges everything we think we know about the distant past. It appears at first glance to be merely a hill, a great grassy mound, perhaps 85 metres across, rising gently from the surrounding countryside like a natural feature of the landscape. But as your eyes adjust to the pale dawn light, you begin to notice what sets this hill apart from all others. Around its base runs a ring of massive standing stones, each one carefully placed, each one bearing the weight of unimaginable age. And there, at the southern face where the morning sun begins to touch the slope, something extraordinary catches the light. A facade of brilliant white quartz, gleaming like snow in the growing daylight, punctuated by darker stones arranged in patterns that speak of deliberate design. This is Newgrange, and it is older than you can easily comprehend. While the pharaohs of Egypt were still centuries away from raising their first pyramid, while the great stone circle of Stonehenge existed only as an idea in minds not yet born, the people of this valley were already completing one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. They finished this monument sometime around 3,200 years, before the birth of Christ, when the world was young and metal was still unknown to the farmers and herders of Western Europe. 5,200 years. The number staggers the imagination. Think of all of recorded history, all the rise and fall of empires, all the births and deaths and forgotten dreams that have passed since these stones were set in place. The builders of Newgrange were separated from the construction of the Parthenon by a greater span of time than separates us from the Parthenon today. When Julius Caesar first set foot in Britain, this mound had already been ancient for 3 millennia. Yet here it stands, patient and enduring, holding its secrets close. The morning wind whispers through the grass that has grown over its earthen bulk, the same wind that once carried the voices of its creators across these fields. What did those voices say? What songs did they sing as they rolled massive stones across 50 miles of countryside? What prayers did they offer as they aligned their monument with such precision that it still captures the light of the winter solstice sun as perfectly today as it did on the very first morning of its completion? You can feel the weight of those questions in the stillness of this place. The Boyne River flows past as it has for countless thousands of years, its waters reflecting the sky and carrying the sediment of ages toward the Irish Sea. The valley spreads around you in gentle undulations, fertile and green, dotted with farms and hedgerows that mark the boundaries between one field and the next. It is peaceful countryside, unremarkable in many ways, the kind of landscape that might lull you into forgetting that you stand at the edge of one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. For this is what defies explanation. The people who built Newgrange had no written language, at least none that has survived. They left behind no chronicles, no king lists, no great poems carved in stone to tell us who they were or why they undertook such an extraordinary project. They had no metal tools, no wheels, no beasts of burden beyond perhaps cattle and dogs. They were farmers, essentially, Neolithic cultivators, who had learned to grow grain and raise livestock, people who lived in houses of wood and thatch and who made their tools from stone and bone and antler. And yet they moved mountains. Literally. They transported hundreds of tons of stone across distances that would challenge modern logistics. They carved intricate spirals and diamond patterns into granite with nothing more than harder stones and infinite patience. They engineered corbelled chambers that have stood for 50 centuries without collapse. They calculated angles and alignments with an accuracy that speaks of profound astronomical knowledge. Most remarkably of all, they did these things not once but repeatedly. Newgrange is merely the most famous member of a complex of monuments that includes Noth and Douth, great passage tombs that rise from this same valley like a constellation of ancient ambition frozen in earth and stone. Together they represent an investment of time, energy, and communal will that dwarfs many of the more famous achievements of the classical world. What drove them to such lengths? What vision sustained them through the decades of backbreaking labour that such construction would have required? What did they hope to achieve in this quiet valley beside the Boyne, and why has their achievement remained hidden in plain sight for so many centuries? These are the questions that draw us into their world, into a time when the boundaries between the living and the dead, between earth and sky, between the mundane and the sacred, were drawn very differently than we draw them today. Their answers lie buried beneath 5 millennia of accumulated soil and legend, waiting to be uncovered by careful archaeology and patient imagination. To understand the people who built Newgrange, we must first step backward through the millennia, beyond the familiar landscapes of recorded history, into a world that existed when the very concept of civilization as we know it was still taking its first tentative steps across the face of the earth. This was the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, when humanity had learned to shape the world around them in ways that would have seemed miraculous to their hunting and gathering ancestors, yet still lived entirely within the embrace of stone and wood and bone. The island of 5,000 years ago was a very different place from the Emerald Isle we know today. The great forests that had grown up after the last retreat of the glaciers still covered much of the landscape, though by the time Newgrange rose from the Boyne Valley, the first farmers had already been clearing patches of woodland for nearly 2 millennia. These were not the dense, impenetrable forests of fairy tale and legend, but rather a more open canopy, punctuated by natural clearings and meadows where aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, grazed alongside red deer and wild boar. The climate was warmer then, perhaps 2 or 3 degrees warmer on average than today, and the growing seasons were longer and more reliable. This climatic optimum, as archaeologists call it, provided the foundation upon which Neolithic society could flourish. The soils of the Boyne Valley, deposited by glacial action during the Great Ice Ages, were rich and deep, perfect for the cultivation of the primitive wheats and barleys that these early farmers had brought with them on their long journey from the south and east. For the people who built Newgrange were not natives of Ireland in the deepest sense. Their ancestors had been part of one of the great migrations of human history, a gradual expansion that had begun thousands of years earlier in the fertile crescent of Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. There, in the shadow of ancient volcanoes, some of humanity's first farmers had learned to domesticate these wild grasses that would become wheat and barley, to tame the wild sheep and cattle that would provide them with meat and milk and wool. Wave by wave, generation by generation, these farming peoples had spread across Europe, following the great river valleys, crossing mountain passes, sailing along coastlines. They brought with them not just their crops and livestock, but their pottery, their stone tools, their burial customs, and perhaps most importantly, their social organisation. For farming, unlike hunting and gathering, requires a different relationship with the land, a different understanding of time and season, and community responsibility. By the time they reached Ireland, perhaps around 4,000 years before Christ, these Neolithic pioneers had developed a sophisticated material culture adapted to the opportunities and challenges of their new homeland. They lived in substantial rectangular houses built of oak posts and planks, with thatched roofs that could withstand the Atlantic storms. Their settlements were small by our standards, perhaps 10 or 20 houses clustered together, but they represented a level of permanence and planning that was revolutionary in human terms. These farmers knew the secrets of the soil. They understood how to clear forest without exhausting the land, how to rotate their crops to maintain fertility, how to manage their livestock through the changing seasons. They had learned to identify the subtle signs that indicated good stone for tool-making, to recognize the plants that could heal and those that could harm, to read the patterns of weather and star that governed their agricultural calendar. Their toolkit was extensive and sophisticated, even though it contained not a single piece of metal. They shaped axes from polished stone that could fell great trees with surprising efficiency. They crafted sickles from flint that harvested grain with precise strokes. They made awls and needles from bone, scrapers from antler, grinding querns from carefully selected granite. Every tool represented hours of patient work, passed down through generations of accumulated knowledge and skill. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these Neolithic communities was their social organisation. The construction of Newgrange was not the work of a single family or clan. The sheer scale of the project, the coordination required, the specialised knowledge of astronomy and engineering that went into its design, all point to a society that had developed mechanisms for large-scale cooperation that went far beyond anything required for simple farming. Archaeological evidence suggests that the communities of the Boyne Valley were connected by networks of exchange that stretched across hundreds of miles. The stones that would eventually form Newgrange came from the Wicklow Mountains to the south and the Mourne Mountains to the north, journeys that would have required careful planning and the cooperation of many different groups. This was not a world of isolated subsistence farmers, but rather a complex web of relationships, obligations, and shared purposes. The decision to build Newgrange when it came represented something unprecedented in human experience. It was not simply a response to immediate practical needs, like shelter or storage or defence. It was a statement about permanence, about the relationship between the living and the dead, about humanity's place in the larger cosmos. It required the ability to imagine a future that stretched beyond the lifetime of any individual, to commit resources and energy to a project whose benefits might not be fully realised for decades. The very fact that such a decision could be made and sustained through the years of construction that followed tells us something profound about the social and spiritual sophistication of these Neolithic communities. They had created not just the technical means to build monuments, but the cultural frameworks necessary to conceive and complete them. Imagine the moment when the decision was made. Somewhere in the Boyne Valley, perhaps during the long nights of winter when the agricultural year had reached its quiet pause, the elders of the scattered farming communities gathered to discuss something unprecedented. The exact nature of their deliberations is lost to us now, buried beneath 50 centuries of accumulated silence, but the result of their planning stands before us still, a testament to human ambition executed with Stone Age precision. The first task would have been to choose the site, and here the builders of Newgrange demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of landscape and symbolism. They selected a natural ridge that commanded sweeping views across the Boyne Valley, a prominence that would make their monument visible for miles in every direction. But this was not simply a matter of vanity or display. The ridge was composed of glacial deposits, a mixture of clay, sand, and stones that would provide a stable foundation for the massive weight to come, yet was soft enough to be shaped and sculpted by their stone and wooden tools. The construction began, as all great works must begin, with the movement of earth. Using wooden spades, antler picks, and wicker baskets, teams of workers began to scrape and dig, to heap and compact, creating the basic form that would support everything else. This was labour on a scale that dwarfs our modern understanding of pre-industrial society. Recent calculations suggest that the completed mound contains approximately 200,000 tons of stone, earth, and other materials, all moved and positioned by human muscle power alone. But even as they shaped the basic earthwork, other teams were engaged in tasks that required them to travel far beyond the Boyne Valley. The white quartz that forms the brilliant facade of Newgrange does not occur naturally anywhere near the construction site. Instead, it had to be collected from beaches and stream beds, in the Wicklow Mountains more than 50 miles to the south across difficult terrain. Similarly, the dark granitic stones that punctuate the quartz facade came from the Mourne Mountains to the north and the Cooley Peninsula to the northeast, journeys that would have taken days or weeks to complete. The logistics of this material transport represent an achievement that challenges our assumptions about Neolithic capabilities. Each quartz cobble, each granite boulder, had to be individually selected, loaded onto some form of sledge or carrying device, and then hauled across miles of forest, bog, and hillside by teams of people working in careful coordination. The total weight of imported stone at Newgrange runs to hundreds of tons, representing thousands of individual journeys and countless hours of backbreaking labour. While some groups ranged across the Irish landscape in search of building materials, others focused on the equally demanding task of shaping the great stones that would form the structural skeleton of the monument. 97 massive curbstones were positioned around the perimeter of the mound, each one carefully selected and shaped to fit its designated place. These were not simply large rocks pulled from nearby fields, but carefully worked megaliths, some weighing several tons, many decorated with intricate carved designs that had to be completed before the stones were moved into their final positions. The passage that leads into the heart of Newgrange represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the entire construction. 90 metres long and rising gradually from the entrance toward the central chamber, this corridor was built using a technique called dry stone walling, where carefully shaped stones are fitted together without mortar, relying on precise cutting and strategic placement to create a structure stable enough to support the enormous weight pressing down from above. The entrance stone itself, positioned at the threshold of the passage, stands as one of the masterpieces of Neolithic art. Covered with spirals, lozenges, and concentric circles carved with tools no harder than the stone itself, it would have taken skilled artisans months or even years to complete. The symbolic meaning of these designs remains a mystery, but their execution demonstrates a level of artistic sophistication that speaks to the presence of specialist craftsmen within these farming communities. As you move along the passage deeper into the heart of the monument, the walls close in around you, built from massive orthostats, upright stones that rise from floor to ceiling like the ribs of some great beast. Above them, smaller stones are carefully cobbled inward, each course projecting slightly beyond the one below, creating a curved ceiling that distributes the weight of the mound evenly across the entire structure. This cobbling technique, while simple in principle, requires extraordinary precision in execution. A miscalculation of even a few degrees could result in catastrophic collapse. The passage leads ultimately to the central chamber, a cruciform space where 3 smaller chambers branch off from a central area, tall enough for a person to stand upright. Here, the corbelled ceiling reaches its full sophistication, rising to a height of nearly 6 meters in a perfect dome that has remained watertight for 5 millennia. The engineering knowledge required to calculate the precise angles and stone placements necessary for such a structure represents a level of architectural understanding that would not be out of place in much later civilizations. Throughout the construction, layers of different materials were carefully alternated within the body of the mound itself. Earth and stone, turf and clay, each layer serving both structural and symbolic purposes. The builders understood intuitively that a mound of uniform composition would be prone to settling and collapse, so they created a heterogeneous structure that would compact evenly and remain stable across the centuries. The final element of construction was perhaps the most visually striking. The brilliant white quartz facade that faces south toward the rising sun was not simply piled against the mound at random, but was carefully arranged in patterns that complemented and enhanced the monument's astronomical alignments. Dark granite stones were interspersed among the white quartz, according to some design principle that remains partially mysterious, creating a facade that would have gleamed like snow in the Irish landscape, visible for miles across the valley. You step across the threshold of Newgrange, your hand briefly touching the great entrance stone with its mesmerizing spirals and diamond patterns, and immediately the world changes around you. The temperature drops several degrees as you leave the Irish morning behind and enter a space that has remained largely unchanged for 5,000 years. The passage ahead of you stretches into darkness, its walls built from massive upright stones that seem to lean inward with the weight of ages, creating a corridor just wide enough for a single person to walk upright, just narrow enough to make you acutely aware that you are moving through something deliberately constructed to focus your attention, to prepare you for whatever lies ahead. The silence here is profound, different from the quiet of the countryside outside. It is the silence of deep places, of spaces that have been sealed away from the ordinary flow of time and weather and human activity. Your footsteps echo softly against the stone walls as you move deeper into the passage, and with each step you become more aware of the intricate artistry that surrounds you. The builders of Newgrange were not content merely to create a functional space. They transformed this passage into a gallery of symbolic expression that speaks across the millennia in a language we can appreciate even if we cannot fully translate. The carved designs that cover many of the passage stones were not afterthoughts, decorative elements added once the construction was complete. Archaeological analysis has revealed that most of these elaborate patterns were carved before the stones were moved into their final positions, a discovery that fundamentally changes our understanding of how this monument was planned and executed. The artists who created these spirals and chevrons and concentric circles worked on stones lying flat in workshops, perhaps scattered across the Boyne Valley, taking months or even years to complete individual panels before they were transported to the construction site and fitted into their designated places. This tells us something remarkable about the society that built Newgrange. They had reached a level of social organisation where individuals could specialise in artistic production, where craftsmen could dedicate enormous amounts of time to creating beauty that would eventually be sealed away in darkness, visible only to those who undertook the ritual journey into the heart of the monument. These were not farmers stealing a few hours from their agricultural duties to scratch simple designs into stone. These were accomplished artists working within sophisticated symbolic traditions, creating works that required not only technical skill, but deep cultural knowledge about the meaning and proper execution of these complex patterns. As you continue along the passage, running your hand along the carved surfaces, you can feel the texture left by their stone tools, the subtle ridges and valleys that speak of countless hours of patient work. The spirals seem to draw your eye inward, creating an almost hypnotic effect that may have been entirely intentional. Recent studies of similar megalithic art have suggested that these patterns, viewed by flickering torchlight, might have been designed to create altered states of consciousness, to prepare visitors for profound spiritual experiences in the sacred space ahead. The passage gradually rises as it penetrates deeper into the mound, and the walls press closer around you until finally you emerge into the central chamber, a cruciform space where 3 smaller alcoves branch off from the main area. Here, in this heart of darkness, archaeologists have found evidence of the monument's primary function. This was a place of the dead, but death understood in ways that our modern sensibilities can only dimly appreciate. The human remains found within the chamber and passage tell a complex story of ritual and remembrance that unfolded over generations. Both cremated and uncremated bones were discovered during the excavations of the 1960s, along with grave goods that provide tantalizing glimpses into the material culture of these Neolithic communities. Beads of various materials, pendants that may have held personal or spiritual significance, carefully crafted flint tools that speak of the continuing importance of stone, technology even in death. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these burials is their selectivity. The chamber could have accommodated many more remains than were actually found there. This was not a communal cemetery, where entire communities laid their dead to rest. Instead, it appears that access to this sacred space was restricted, reserved perhaps for individuals of particular importance, certain families, or those who had achieved specific ritual status within their communities. The daily lives of the people who built and used Newgrange can be glimpsed through the archaeological records scattered across the Boyne Valley. These were farming communities, but farming at a level of sophistication that produced significant surplus beyond immediate subsistence needs. Their fields of wheat and barley stretched across the fertile soils of the valley floor. Their cattle grazed in managed pastures that required careful attention to seasonal rhythms and resource management. They had developed craft specializations that went far beyond the simple production of basic tools and pottery. The beads found in the chamber, for instance, required not only access to raw materials but sophisticated understanding of drilling and shaping techniques. Some were made from amber that could only have come from distant shores, evidence of trade networks that connected these Irish farmers to communities hundreds of miles away. Others were crafted from local materials with such skill that they represent the work of dedicated specialists, artisans whose expertise was valued highly enough that their products accompanied the dead into the afterlife. During the long winter months when agricultural work slowed to its annual minimum, these communities turned their attention to other pursuits. This was when the great construction projects advanced most rapidly, when teams of workers could be organised for the massive undertakings required to build monuments like Newgrange. But it was also when the less visible but equally important work of cultural transmission took place. Stories were told, skills were taught, and the complex symbolic systems that governed their understanding of life and death and the natural world were passed from one generation to the next. Of all the mysteries that Newgrange holds within its ancient stones, none captures the imagination quite like the phenomenon that unfolds each year during the depths of winter, when the sun reaches its lowest point in the southern sky and the days have shortened to their absolute minimum. It is then, during those precious few mornings around the winter solstice, that this Neolithic monument reveals its most extraordinary secret, an alignment so precise and purposeful that it transforms our understanding of what these Stone Age farmers knew about the cosmos and their place within it. The discovery of this solar alignment came relatively late in the modern study of Newgrange. For centuries, antiquarians and archaeologists had marvelled at the monument's construction, its art, its obvious importance to the communities that built it. But it was not until the excavations of the 1960s that the true sophistication of its astronomical orientation became apparent. The archaeologist Michael O'Kelly was the first to witness and document what happens when the winter sun rises over the Boyne Valley and finds its way into the heart of the ancient tomb. Above the entrance to the passage, the builders had created what archaeologists now call a roof box, a carefully engineered opening that remained hidden for millennia beneath accumulated earth and debris. This rectangular slot, precisely positioned and angled, serves as a kind of astronomical instrument, a device for capturing and channeling the light of the rising sun during those few critical days when the Earth reaches the extreme point of its annual journey around our star. The geometry involved in creating this alignment speaks to a level of astronomical knowledge that challenges every assumption we might make about the intellectual capabilities of Neolithic societies. The builders had to understand not only the basic fact that the sun rises at different points along the horizon throughout the year, but also the precise mechanics of that movement, the subtle variations from day to day, the exact angles required to capture the light during such a brief and specific window of time. Picture yourself standing in the central chamber of Newgrange on one of those December mornings when the alignment functions as its creators intended. The passage behind you stretches away into darkness, a corridor that has remained sealed in shadow for most of the year. Outside, beyond layers of stone and earth, the Irish countryside lies locked in winter's grip, the fields dormant, the trees bare, the world seemingly held in suspension between one agricultural cycle and the next. Then, as the sun clears the horizon to the southeast, something miraculous begins to happen. A narrow beam of golden light appears at the far end of the passage, brilliant against the ancient stones. Slowly, deliberately, this shaft of illumination begins to move along the floor of the corridor, creeping toward you with the steady precision of a sundial shadow, but infinitely more dramatic in its effect. The light travels the full 19 meters of the passage, illuminating carved spirals and diamond patterns that have waited in darkness for this moment, bringing the megalithic art to life in a display that must have seemed supernatural to the people who first witnessed it 5,000 years ago. As the beam reaches the central chamber, it spreads across the floor like liquid gold, transforming the space into something entirely different from the tomb-like darkness that characterizes it during the rest of the year. For approximately 17 minutes, this illumination continues, bathing the chamber in the direct light of the winter sun, before the Earth's rotation carries the solar disk beyond the narrow window of the roof box and the ancient space returns to its customary darkness. 17 minutes of light in the heart of winter, a brief resurrection of solar power at the very moment when it seemed most distant and weak. The precision required to achieve this effect cannot be overstated. The roof box had to be positioned at exactly the right height, angled at precisely the correct degree, aligned with mathematical accuracy to capture the sun's rays during those specific days when its rising position reached the southernmost point of its annual arc. A deviation of even a few degrees in any direction would have resulted in complete failure, in light that missed its target entirely or illuminated the chamber at the wrong time of year. This astronomical knowledge had to be accumulated over generations of careful observation. Someone, at some point in the prehistoric past, had begun the patient work of tracking the sun's movements throughout the year, noting the changing points of sunrise along the eastern horizon, recognizing the patterns that governed these variations. This information was then preserved, refined, and ultimately incorporated into the very architecture of Newgrange in a way that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both engineering and astronomy. But the winter solstice alignment was not merely a technical achievement. It was also, and perhaps more importantly, a statement about the relationship between human beings and the natural world, about the possibility of predicting and even controlling cosmic forces through careful observation and skillful construction. At the darkest moment of the year, when the sun's power seemed most diminished and the return of spring most uncertain, the builders of Newgrange had created a guaranteed resurrection, a ritual demonstration that light would indeed return, that the cycles of nature could be counted upon to continue. The psychological impact of this annual event on the Neolithic communities of the Boyne Valley can barely be imagined. In a world without artificial lighting, without the countless technological buffers that insulate modern people from direct dependence on natural cycles, the winter solstice represented a moment of genuine uncertainty about the future. The shortening days of autumn inevitably raised questions about whether the sun would indeed recover its strength, whether spring would return, whether the agricultural cycle that sustained life would continue for another year. The construction of Newgrange poses fundamental questions about the nature of the society that conceived and executed such an ambitious project. When we consider the sheer scale of the undertaking, the coordination of labour it required, the specialised knowledge it demanded, we are forced to confront assumptions about social organisation in Neolithic communities that may be far too simplistic for the complex realities of 5,000 years ago. Recent advances in archaeological science have provided tantalising glimpses into the social world of Newgrange through the analysis of human remains found within the monument itself. In particular, the study of ancient DNA extracted from a petrous bone discovered in the central chamber has yielded results that have fundamentally altered our understanding of who was granted access to this sacred space. The genetic analysis revealed that this individual, an adult male who lived and died around the time of Newgrange's primary use, had parents who were likely first-degree relatives, possibly brother and sister. This discovery has generated considerable scholarly debate about what such evidence might tell us about the social structure of these Neolithic communities. Some researchers have suggested that the presence of an individual born of such a close consanguineous union within the most sacred space of the monument points toward the existence of a hereditary elite, a ruling class that maintained its status through carefully controlled marriages designed to concentrate power and perhaps preserve what they perceived as sacred bloodlines. The parallels with later historical societies are obvious and compelling. Ancient Egypt, the Inca Empire, the royal dynasties of medieval Europe all practiced various forms of close kinship marriage as a means of maintaining dynastic control and religious legitimacy. If similar practices were at work in Neolithic Ireland, it would suggest a level of social stratification and political organisation far more complex than the egalitarian farming communities that many scholars have envisioned. Yet caution is essential when interpreting such evidence. The sample size remains frustratingly small, a single individual whose genetic history may or may not be representative of broader patterns within these ancient communities. Modern genetics has revealed that close kinship unions, while often discouraged or prohibited in contemporary societies, were not uncommon in small populations throughout human history, sometimes occurring for reasons that had nothing to do with deliberate social policy or elite marriage strategies. What we can say with greater confidence is that the construction of Newgrange required social mechanisms that went far beyond anything necessary for simple subsistence farming. The monument represents an investment of resources and labour that could only have been sustained by communities that had achieved significant agricultural surplus, populations that had moved well beyond the basic requirements of survival into realms of symbolic expression and monumental architecture. The organisation required for such a project speaks to sophisticated systems of leadership and coordination. Someone had to make decisions about where to source materials, how to transport massive stones across difficult terrain, which skilled craftsmen should be assigned to which tasks, how to feed and house the workers during the decades of construction. These were not decisions that could be made by consensus in village assemblies or left to individual initiative. They required centralised planning, hierarchical organisation, and the authority to commit substantial community resources to a project whose benefits would not be realised for years or even generations. The symbolic power of Newgrange within its landscape cannot be underestimated. Rising from its prominent ridge, visible for miles in every direction, The monument would have served as a constant reminder of the capabilities and ambitions of the communities that built it. In a world where political power was necessarily local and personal, where authority depended on reputation and demonstration rather than written law or institutional structure, such monuments functioned as permanent assertions of social status and collective achievement. But Newgrange was more than simply a display of wealth or power. Its astronomical alignments, its carefully planned integration with the seasonal cycles that governed agricultural life, its function as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, all point toward a much more complex understanding of its role within Neolithic society. This was not merely a tomb for important individuals, nor simply a temple where religious ceremonies were conducted. It was, in the fullest sense, a cosmological statement, a physical embodiment of how these communities understood their relationship to the natural world and their place within the larger order of existence. The monument served as a focal point for collective identity, a place where scattered farming communities could come together to participate in rituals that reinforced their shared beliefs and social bonds. The winter solstice illumination, in particular, would have provided an annual opportunity for gatherings that transcended the boundaries of individual settlements, creating experiences of communal witness to cosmic events that validated the astronomical knowledge and ritual authority of those who controlled access to the monument. The decision to seal precious resources, both material and human, within the monument tells us something profound about the worldview of its builders. In societies focused purely on practical considerations, the labour invested in Newgrange could have built dozens of houses, cleared hundreds of acres of farmland, or created vast stores of preserved food against times of scarcity. Instead, these Neolithic communities chose to dedicate enormous resources to creating something that was, in purely economic terms, completely unproductive. This choice reflects a society that had moved beyond immediate survival concerns into realms of meaning and symbol that we can recognize as fundamentally human, even if we cannot fully understand their specific content. The builders of Newgrange were making statements about permanence, about the importance of maintaining connections between past, present and future, about the necessity of creating spaces where the sacred could be encountered and honoured. Newgrange did not emerge from isolation. Despite its remote position in what we now perceive as the rural countryside of County Meath, this monument was part of a much larger world of connection and exchange that stretched across the face of Neolithic Europe. To understand its true significance, we must widen our perspective beyond the Boyne Valley itself and consider how the builders of this remarkable tomb participated in networks of trade, communication, and cultural influence that linked communities from the Atlantic shores of Ireland to the Mediterranean coastlands far to the south. The most immediate context for understanding Newgrange lies in its relationship to the other great monuments that share the Boyne Valley landscape. Just a few miles away, the equally impressive passage tombs of Knowth and Dowth rise from the same fertile river terrace, creating what archaeologists now recognise as one of Europe's most concentrated displays of Neolithic monumental architecture. Together, these three sites form the core of what UNESCO has designated as Brúna Boyne, the Palace of the Boyne, a landscape so rich in prehistoric remains that it has been granted World Heritage status. Knowth, the largest of the three monuments, contains not one but two passage tombs built back to back within the same mound, along with smaller satellite tombs that cluster around its perimeter like planets orbiting a great star. The decoration at Knowth surpasses even Newgrange in its complexity and extent, with more megalithic art than has been found at any other European site of comparable age. Dowth, though less completely excavated, appears to follow similar architectural principles while incorporating its own distinctive variations on the passage tomb theme. The concentration of such monumental effort within a relatively small area tells us something important about the Boyne Valley's role in the wider Neolithic world. This was clearly a landscape of special significance, a place where communities were willing to invest extraordinary resources in creating permanent markers of their presence and their beliefs. But the valley's importance extended far beyond its immediate borders, drawing materials and perhaps pilgrims from across the Irish landscape and beyond. The stone that forms the structural skeleton of these monuments provides clear evidence for long-distance connections that challenge our assumptions about the isolation of prehistoric communities. The white quartz that creates Newgrange's brilliant facade was collected from beaches and stream beds in the Wicklow Mountains, more than 50 miles to the south across terrain, that would have presented significant challenges to Neolithic transport methods. The darker stones that punctuate this quartz facade came from equally distant sources in the Morne and Cooley Mountains to the north and northeast. These journeys represent more than simple material procurement. They speak to social relationships that must have existed between the communities of the Boyne Valley and groups scattered across much of the eastern half of Ireland. The transport of such quantities of stone would have required not only enormous physical effort, but also careful negotiation, ongoing cooperation, and probably reciprocal obligations that bound these distant communities together in networks of mutual support and exchange. Similar connections can be traced through other categories of material culture, found at Neolithic sites throughout Ireland and Britain. The distinctive pottery styles, tool-making traditions, and artistic motifs that characterize this period show clear evidence of communication and influence that crossed tribal boundaries and geographic barriers. Ideas, techniques, and symbolic systems flowed along the same routes that carried stone and other trade goods, creating a surprisingly cosmopolitan cultural world despite the apparent simplicity of the technology available to these ancient communities. The passage tomb tradition itself represents perhaps the clearest example of this prehistoric connectivity. The basic architectural vocabulary of Newgrange, with its long entrance corridor leading to a cruciform chamber covered by a corbelled dome, can be found repeated with variations across a vast area of Atlantic Europe. Similar monuments exist in Brittany, in western France, where sites like Gavrinis and Barnenay demonstrate the same sophisticated understanding of megalithic construction techniques. The Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland contain passage tombs that show clear architectural relationships to the Irish examples, while Wales, Cornwall, and other parts of the British Isles provide additional links in this chain of prehistoric monument building. The megalithic art that adorns these structures provides even more compelling evidence for shared symbolic traditions that transcended local boundaries. The spirals, diamonds, and concentric circles carved into the stones of Newgrange find direct parallels in monuments hundreds or even thousands of miles away. These were not random decorative choices, but rather elements of a sophisticated symbolic language that was understood and employed by communities across much of Atlantic Europe. Such widespread distribution of architectural and artistic traditions cannot be explained by simple coincidence or independent invention. Instead, it points to active networks of communication that allowed ideas, techniques, and symbolic systems to spread across vast distances, despite the apparent limitations of Neolithic transport and communication technology. These networks probably operated through chains of local connections, with ideas and innovations passing from one community to the next, along established routes of trade and social contact. The implications of this connectivity for our understanding of Neolithic society are profound. Rather than isolated farming villages scratching out a subsistence existence in prehistoric wilderness, we begin to see evidence for sophisticated social and economic networks that facilitated not only the exchange of goods and materials, but also the circulation of ideas, beliefs, and technical innovations on a truly continental scale. The story of Newgrange is not one of sudden catastrophe or dramatic collapse, but rather of gradual transformation, the slow erosion of the conditions that had made such monuments both possible and necessary. Like the gentle weathering of stone by wind and rain, the changes that eventually diminished Newgrange's central role in the spiritual and social life of the Boyne Valley communities unfolded over centuries, so gradually that no single generation would have been aware of the larger pattern of decline. By the time the Bronze Age dawned in Ireland, sometime around 2000 years before Christ, the world that had created Newgrange was already becoming something different. The archaeological record from this period shows clear evidence of changing priorities, shifting cultural practices, and new forms of social organisation that place different demands on community resources and attention. The great age of passage tomb construction was drawing to a close, not through any conscious decision to abandon the old ways, but through the subtle pressure of changing circumstances that made other pursuits seem more urgent or more meaningful. The introduction of metalworking, even in its earliest and most rudimentary forms, represented more than simply a technological advance. Bronze tools and weapons required access to copper and tin, materials that were not evenly distributed across the landscape, and that had to be obtained through increasingly complex networks of trade and exchange. The communities that controlled access to these new technologies or who possessed the knowledge necessary to work with them, found themselves at significant advantage over their neighbours who remained dependent on stone and bone implements. This technological shift created new forms of social differentiation and competition that had not existed during the purely Neolithic period. Where the builders of Newgrange had invested their surplus resources in monumental architecture that served the entire community, Bronze Age societies began to channel their wealth into portable objects that marked individual status and power. Elaborate bronze weapons, ornate jewellery, and imported luxury goods became the preferred means of displaying wealth and authority, a transformation that fundamentally altered the relationship between individual ambition and collective achievement. The landscape itself was changing as well, shaped by centuries of human activity that had transformed the original post-glacial environment into something increasingly managed and controlled. The great forests that had once covered much of Ireland were being cleared at an accelerating pace to provide agricultural land for growing populations. The wild aurochs and other large mammals that had shared the landscape with the earliest farmers were being driven toward extinction by hunting pressure and habitat loss. As the forest cover diminished and agricultural activity intensified, the delicate balance between human communities and their environment began to shift in ways that placed new stresses on traditional social arrangements. Soil erosion, probably accelerated by deforestation and overgrazing, may have reduced the productivity of some agricultural areas. Climate change, subtle but persistent, was making certain farming practices less reliable than they had been during the warmer and more stable conditions of the Neolithic climatic optimum. Archaeological evidence from the Bronze Age levels at Newgrange itself tells a story of changing use patterns that reflect these broader social transformations. While the monument continued to function as a sacred site, the nature of the activities conducted there appears to have evolved in significant ways. The great communal burials that had characterized its original use gave way to smaller, more individualized deposits that suggest different concepts of death, memory, and the relationship between the living and the dead. Small timber circles were added to the landscape around the monument during this period, structures that required far less investment of labour and resources than the great stone passages, but that may have served similar ritual functions for communities that no longer possessed the organisational capacity or the collective will to undertake truly monumental projects. These wooden structures, long since decayed and known to us only through the post holes that mark their former locations, speak to a world in which permanence had become less important than adaptability, where communities preferred solutions that could be modified or abandoned as circumstances changed. The artistic traditions that had flourished during the construction of the Great Passage tombs also showed signs of transformation during the Bronze Age. The complex megalithic art that covered the stones of Newgrange represented a symbolic language that required specialized knowledge to create and interpret. As the social context that had supported such specialization changed, this artistic tradition gradually faded, replaced by different forms of expression that reflected new priorities and new understandings of the relationship between human creativity and spiritual meaning. Foreign influences, carried along the same trade routes that brought copper and tin to Ireland, introduced new religious concepts and ritual practices that competed with the indigenous traditions associated with monuments like Newgrange. These were not necessarily superior or more appealing alternatives, but they represented different ways of understanding the cosmos and humanity's place within it, ways that may have seemed more relevant to the changing conditions of Bronze Age life. The transformation was neither sudden nor complete. For centuries, Newgrange continued to hold significance for the communities of the Boyne Valley, but it was a significance that gradually became more historical than immediate, more ancestral than contemporary. The monument remained a link to the past, a reminder of what previous generations had been capable of achieving, but it no longer served as the focal point for the most important ritual and social activities of living communities. As centuries passed, and the original context of Newgrange faded from living memory, the monument entered a different phase of its existence, one in which imagination and speculation began to fill the spaces left by forgotten knowledge. The Irish landscape is particularly rich in such transformations, where ancient structures become woven into later mythologies, where prehistoric realities are gradually overlaid with layers of story and symbol that reflect the concerns and beliefs of succeeding generations, rather than the intentions of the original builders. The medieval Irish Newgrange by the name Cian Brú, the fairy mound of the mansion, and they peopled it with a pantheon of otherworldly beings whose adventures and conflicts provided explanations for mysteries that could no longer be understood through direct cultural transmission. In these stories, the monument became the dwelling place of the Tuatha De Danann, the legendary race of divine beings who were said to have ruled Ireland before the arrival of mortal humans. Chief among these mythical inhabitants was the Dagda, the good god, a figure of immense power and appetite who wielded a magical club that could kill 9 men with a single blow and restore them to life with the other end. The tales also spoke of Engus, the young god of love and poetry, who through clever wordplay managed to claim permanent ownership of Newgrange from his father, the Dagda. The story tells how Engus asked to possess the mound for a day and a night, and when his father agreed, the young god pointed out that time itself consists of nothing but days and nights, thus securing eternal tenure through linguistic cunning. These mythological narratives, while obviously far removed from the historical realities of Neolithic life, preserve important cultural memories about the significance of the site and its association with cosmic powers and seasonal renewal. Most remarkably, the medieval myths retained clear references to the winter solstice phenomenon that lies at the heart of Newgrange's astronomical function. The stories tell of how the sun was commanded to stand still above the mound, creating a day that lasted an entire year, allowing time for crucial events in the divine narrative to unfold. This mythological detail, preserved through dozens of generations of oral transmission, represents a remarkable continuity of cultural memory that spans thousands of years between the monument's original function and its incorporation into later Irish tradition. When European antiquarians began to take systematic interest in ancient monuments during the 17th and 18th centuries, they brought to sites like Newgrange a set of assumptions and prejudices that often obscured more than they revealed. The intellectual climate of this period was dominated by classical learning and biblical chronology, frameworks that left little room for acknowledging the sophisticated achievements of prehistoric populations that had left no written records to document their capabilities. Faced with the obvious technical sophistication of Newgrange, these early scholars found it easier to attribute the monument to exotic foreign influences rather than to the indigenous populations whose descendants still lived in the surrounding countryside. Egyptian colonists, Phoenician traders, even refugee populations from the lost continent of Atlantis were all proposed as the true architects of the monument, their advanced civilizations supposedly carrying the necessary knowledge to Ireland during some dimly imagined age of global migration and cultural diffusion. Such interpretations reflected the intellectual limitations and cultural prejudices of their time, rather than any genuine evidence for foreign construction. The assumption that prehistoric Europeans were incapable of sophisticated architectural and astronomical achievements was deeply embedded in scholarly thinking that regarded technological progress as a linear development from primitive beginnings toward modern sophistication, with ancient civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia representing the only possible sources of early advanced knowledge. The application of modern archaeological methods to Newgrange during the 20th century began to overturn these romantic misconceptions and replace them with a more complex but ultimately more impressive reality. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found within the monument provided the first reliable chronology for its construction, pushing its origins back into the Neolithic period and demonstrating conclusively that it predated the Great Pyramids of Egypt by several centuries. More recently, advances in genetic analysis have provided direct evidence about the people buried within Newgrange, revealing them to be part of the same population that had spread across Atlantic Europe during the Neolithic expansion. Farmers whose ultimate origins lay in Anatolia, but who had been established in Ireland for many generations before they undertook the construction of their great monument. These were not exotic foreigners bringing advanced knowledge from distant civilizations, but local communities that had developed sophisticated understanding of architecture, astronomy, and symbolic expression through their own cultural evolution. The winter solstice alignment, far from representing mysterious ancient wisdom transmitted from lost civilizations, can now be understood as the product of careful observation and patient experimentation carried out over generations by people whose survival depended on intimate knowledge of seasonal cycles and astronomical patterns. The precision of the alignment speaks not to supernatural intervention or alien instruction, but to the remarkable capabilities of human intelligence when directed towards systematic observation of natural phenomena. This myth-busting process has not diminished the wonder of Newgrange, but rather has revealed it to be even more remarkable than the romantic theories of previous centuries suggested. The monument stands as testimony to the indigenous creativity and technical sophistication of Neolithic communities that achieved extraordinary things through purely human intelligence, determination, and social cooperation. The transformation of Newgrange from sacred monument to forgotten ruin, and from forgotten ruin to celebrated heritage site, tells a story that extends far beyond the particular history of one Irish tomb. It is a story about how human societies constantly reshape their relationship with the past, how each generation finds new meanings in the remnants left by their predecessors, how monuments originally built for purposes we can barely comprehend become vessels for entirely different kinds of significance as the centuries roll by. After the Bronze Age communities of the Boyne Valley had moved away from the ritual practices that had once made Newgrange central to their spiritual lives, the monument entered a long period of gradual decline that would last for more than 3,000 years. The roof box that had been so carefully designed to capture the winter solstice light became blocked by accumulated soil and debris. The entrance to the passage was sealed, perhaps deliberately as part of some closing ritual, or simply through the natural processes of erosion and sedimentation that slowly transformed the surrounding landscape. As the mound settled and weathered, as grass grew over its earthen bulk and trees took root in its sides, Newgrange gradually came to resemble what local people assumed it actually was, a natural hill that happened to rise rather more dramatically than the surrounding terrain. The white quartz facade that had once gleamed like snow across the Boyne Valley disappeared beneath a covering of soil and vegetation, and the great curbstones that ringed the monument's base became buried so deeply that only their uppermost edges remained visible, looking like nothing more than the random boulders that dot Irish pasture land. For generation after generation, farmers grazed their cattle on the grass that grew above the tombs of Neolithic chieftains. They planted their crops in fields that stretched right up to the base of the mysterious mound, never suspecting that beneath their ploughs lay one of Europe's greatest archaeological treasures. The land was productive and well drained, perfect for the mixed farming that had sustained communities in this valley since Neolithic times, and there seemed no reason to question the natural features that bounded their fields. The rediscovery of Newgrange in 1699 came about through the kind of accident that often characterises major archaeological finds. A local landowner, searching for building stone to use in road construction, ordered his workers to begin quarrying what appeared to be a convenient source of materials from the side of the large mound on his property. When their digging revealed not loose stone but carefully fitted megalithic architecture, they had unknowingly opened the first modern entrance to the passage tomb that had been sealed for millennia. The initial response to this discovery reflected the intellectual frameworks and cultural assumptions of the late 17th century. Without any scientific methods for dating archaeological remains, without any understanding of the deep prehistory of Ireland or Europe more generally, early investigators could only interpret what they found through the lens of classical learning and biblical chronology. The monument was variously described as a Danish fort, a Roman temple, or some kind of exotic tomb built by ancient colonists whose origins remained mysterious. For nearly 3 centuries after its rediscovery, Newgrange remained accessible to anyone curious enough to crawl through its passage with a candle or lantern, a situation that resulted in considerable damage to its delicate interior features. Victorian tourists carved their names into the ancient stones, souvenir hunters chipped away fragments of megalithic art, and well-meaning but archaeologically ignorant visitors attempted their own excavations in search of treasure or additional chambers. The transformation of Newgrange into a properly studied and protected archaeological site began in earnest during the 1960s, when Professor Michael O'Kelly of University College Cork initiated the comprehensive excavation and restoration project that would define our modern understanding of the monument. For more than a decade, O'Kelly and his team worked to uncover the original form of the tomb, clearing away centuries of accumulated debris, carefully mapping every stone and artifact, documenting the megalithic art with unprecedented precision. It was during these excavations that O'Kelly rediscovered the roof box and became the first person in modern times to witness the winter solstice illumination, an experience he described with the wonder of someone who had stumbled upon a miracle preserved in stone. His careful documentation of this phenomenon finally provided scientific confirmation of the astronomical sophistication that had been built into the monument 5,000 years earlier. The restoration of Newgrange's quartz facade during this same period became a source of ongoing controversy within the archaeological community. O'Kelly and his team found thousands of quartz fragments scattered in front of the monument, clear evidence that a brilliant white wall had once stood there. However, the exact original arrangement of these materials could not be determined from the archaeological evidence, forcing the restorers to make educated guesses about how the facade should be reconstructed. Today, Newgrange occupies a position in Irish and international consciousness that would have been unimaginable to its original builders. It has become a symbol of Irish heritage and prehistoric achievement, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the world. The winter solstice illumination, once witnessed only by a select few who had earned or inherited access to the sacred chamber, is now the subject of an annual lottery that determines which modern pilgrims will be permitted to experience this ancient miracle. When we consider what has survived of the world that created Newgrange, we are confronted with a profound paradox that lies at the heart of all archaeological endeavour. The most durable aspects of this ancient civilization are also, in many ways, the least revealing of its essential character. We have the stones, magnificent in their permanence, carved with symbols whose meaning remains largely opaque to us. We have the monument itself, its passages and chambers intact after 50 centuries, its astronomical alignment still functioning with clockwork precision. Yet the voices that once echoed through these spaces, the beliefs that motivated their construction, the daily rhythms of life that gave them context and meaning, these have vanished as completely as morning mist from the Boyne Valley. The silence that surrounds Newgrange is not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of the entire oral tradition that once explained and justified its existence. In societies without writing, knowledge was preserved through storytelling, through songs and ceremonies, through the patient repetition of sacred narratives that connected each generation to the wisdom of their ancestors. These oral traditions were as carefully constructed and as essential to cultural survival as the stone monuments themselves, but they possessed a fragility that no amount of engineering skill could overcome. We can imagine the winter solstice ceremonies that once took place within the monument's chambers, the carefully rehearsed rituals that transformed the annual return of the sun into a moment of profound spiritual significance. There would have been specific songs for the occasion, particular words that had to be spoken at precisely the right moment, as the light crept along the passage floor. There would have been traditional foods prepared for the feast that followed, stories told about the mythical figures who first established these observances, prayers offered for the renewal of life that the lengthening days would bring. All of this rich ceremonial life, the entire framework of belief and practice that made Newgrange meaningful to its creators, has disappeared without trace. The astronomical phenomenon continues, as reliable as ever, but the human interpretation that once gave it significance exists now only in fragments, glimpses caught in later Irish mythology that may or may not preserve authentic memories of the monument's original purpose. The megalithic art that covers so many of the stones presents us with perhaps the most tantalizing example of this lost knowledge. These spirals and diamond patterns, these concentric circles and zigzag lines, clearly represent a sophisticated symbolic language that was once as meaningful to its users as written text is to us. Each symbol was deliberately chosen, carefully placed, precisely executed according to artistic and religious conventions that governed their proper use and interpretation. Some of these symbols appear again and again, not only at Newgrange but at other passage tombs across Ireland and Western Europe, suggesting shared meanings that transcended local boundaries. The triple spiral that dominates the entrance stone, the diamond patterns that frame the passage, the cup marks that dot many of the interior surfaces, all of these were part of a coherent symbolic system that helped people understand their relationship to the cosmos and their obligations to both the living and the dead. Yet we remain, in the deepest sense, illiterate when confronted with this ancient writing system. We can describe the symbols, classify them, note their distribution and frequency, but we cannot read them. The key to their interpretation died with the last generation that fully understood their meaning, sometime during those long centuries when new forms of social organization and new systems of belief gradually replaced the traditions that had sustained the monument's original significance. What does survive, however, carries its own profound testimony to human achievement and ingenuity. The monument itself stands as proof that sophisticated understanding of astronomy, engineering, and architectural acoustics was not the exclusive province of literate civilizations. The precision of the winter solstice alignment demonstrates observational skills and mathematical knowledge that required generations to develop and perfect. The stability of the corbelled chambers speaks to engineering principles that modern builders still respect and employ. Perhaps most remarkably, the landscape memory itself has proven surprisingly durable. Even after millennia of cultural change, the Irish countryside around Newgrange retained a sense that this place was special, different, connected to powers and purposes that transcended ordinary human experience. The medieval myths that grew up around the monument, while clearly not historical in any literal sense, preserved essential truths about its astronomical function and its role as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. In the end, what Newgrange offers us is not answers but better questions, not solutions but deeper mysteries. It stands as a reminder that human creativity and ambition are not recent innovations, that the desire to create meaning from chaos, to build permanence in the face of mortality, to align human purpose with cosmic rhythms, represents one of our species' most ancient and enduring characteristics. As we reach the end of our journey through the mysteries of Newgrange, it seems fitting to pause and consider what this ancient monument might teach us about the nature of time itself, about the relationship between human ambition and cosmic permanence, about the quiet wisdom that emerges from contemplating achievements that have outlasted the civilizations that created them. In our restless modern world, where change accelerates at an ever-increasing pace and permanence seems increasingly elusive, there is something deeply comforting about encountering a human creation that has remained essentially unchanged for 50 centuries. The builders of Newgrange lived in what we might consider a simpler time, yet their lives were governed by complexities and uncertainties that we can barely imagine. They faced the same fundamental challenges that confront every human generation: how to create meaning from the raw materials of existence, how to build something lasting in the face of inevitable mortality, how to align individual desires with collective needs, how to find purpose in a universe that seems, at first glance, indifferent to human aspirations. Their solution was to create a monument that functioned simultaneously as tomb, temple, and astronomical observatory, a structure that anchored their community's spiritual life to the eternal rhythms of earth and sky. In doing so, they demonstrated a profound understanding of what we might call the ecology of meaning, the recognition that human significance emerges not from isolation but from connection, not from domination of natural forces but from harmonious alignment with them. The winter solstice illumination that still occurs each December morning serves as an annual reminder of this ancient wisdom. For 17 minutes, the same beam of light that first entered the chamber 5,000 years ago continues its patient journey along the passage floor, connecting us directly to the intentions and achievements of people whose names we will never know, but whose understanding of cosmic relationships we can still witness and appreciate. There is something both humbling and inspiring about this continuity. The empires that the builders of Newgrange never knew would one day rise have long since fallen into dust. The languages they never heard spoken have become the medium for poetry and philosophy, have risen to dominate vast territories, and have then faded into scholarly footnotes. The technologies they never imagined have transformed. Human life beyond recognition have connected the globe in networks of communication and trade, and have become obsolete in turn. Yet through all these transformations, the simple relationship between Earth and Sun that governs our planet's seasons has remained constant. The winter solstice still marks the moment when darkness reaches its greatest extent and begins its retreat toward spring. The same celestial mechanics that the Neolithic farmers observed and celebrated continue to govern the basic rhythms of agricultural life, even in our urban age when most people have lost direct connection to seasonal cycles. Perhaps this is the most important lesson that Newgrange offers to our contemporary world, that lasting achievement requires us to ground our ambitions in realities larger and more enduring than the immediate concerns of any single generation. The monument has survived not because its builders possessed superior technology or greater wealth than their successors, but because they aligned their most significant creative effort with patterns that transcend human timescales. In our age of rapid change and planned obsolescence, when so much of what we create is designed to become outdated within years or even months of its completion, There is profound wisdom in contemplating a human achievement that was built to last forever and has largely succeeded in that audacious goal. The stones of Newgrange remind us that it is possible to think and plan and build beyond the horizons of individual lifetimes, to create works that serve not just our immediate needs, but the needs of people we will never meet who will inhabit futures we cannot imagine. The mystery of Newgrange is ultimately the mystery of human persistence itself, the stubborn refusal of our species to accept that mortality and forgetting represent the final word about the meaning of existence. In every generation, some people have felt compelled to create something that will outlast their own brief passage through time, to contribute to a conversation that began before they were born and will continue long after they are gone. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you might find comfort in the thought that somewhere in the Irish countryside, an ancient monument continues its patient dialogue with the sky, marking time according to rhythms that were ancient when our oldest stories were new. The spiral carvings on its stones catch no light in the darkness, but they remain silent testimony to the enduring human desire to create beauty and meaning in the face of an uncertain world. The same stars that guided the builders of Newgrange across the darkness of their own uncertainties continue to wheel overhead, following the same paths, offering the same quiet reassurance that some things endure, that some truths remain constant, that the fundamental creativity and curiosity that built Newgrange still flows through human hearts today. Rest well, knowing that you are part of this ancient story, this ongoing dialogue between human aspiration and cosmic patience, this conversation that began in the mists of prehistory and continues still in the quiet moments when we pause to wonder at the achievements of those who came before us and to dream of what we might leave for those who will come after.